Sometimes the loneliness of living alone in the mountains feels like a blessing until your only companion starts keeping secrets from you. For 70-year-old Silas McCrae, his half-wolf dog Bristle was all the family he had left in the Wind River Range. But one spring, Bristle began disappearing into the woods every day, always heading toward the same rocky hill. Silas followed his dog and found a hidden cave behind a waterfall. Inside was an old frontier cache with furs, rifles, and gold dust, but what shocked him was a yellowed letter addressed in his father's handwriting. The cave had belonged to his father's old trapping crew. Someone had left behind more than supplies. They had buried a secret about Silas's family and the mother he never knew. What truth had been waiting 50 years for him to find? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Silas McCrae had been living in the Wind River Range for 23 years, and in all that time he'd never once regretted the decision to leave civilization behind. His cabin sat tucked into a grove of ancient pines, sheltered from the worst of the mountain winds by a natural ridge of granite that rose like a protective wall behind his modest home. The structure itself was solid, thick logs, chinked with moss and clay, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows positioned to catch the morning sun while staying hidden from any wandering eyes that might venture this far into the wilderness. At 70, Silas moved with the careful economy of a man who understood his body's limitations but refused to surrender to them. His hair had gone silver-white years ago, hanging past his shoulders when he didn't tie it back for work. Deep lines mapped his weathered face, each one earned through decades of squinting into sun and snow, wind and rain. His hands, gnarled from arthritis but still capable, bore the permanent stains of a life lived outdoors, soil under the nails, calluses thick as leather, scars from 1,000 small accidents with knives and axes and the sharp edges of mountain living. The morning routine never varied: rise before dawn, stoke the fire, put coffee on to boil in the old tin pot that had belonged to his grandfather. While the coffee heated, he'd step outside to check the weather, breathing in the thin air that still made his chest work a little harder than it used to. Then came the inventory woodpile, water barrel, the small garden plot where he coaxed potatoes and turnips from the rocky soil. Everything had to be maintained, repaired, anticipated. Up here, neglect could kill you as surely as a grizzly bear. Bristle had been part of this routine for 8 years now. The dog was a magnificent creature, standing nearly 3 feet at the shoulder, with the thick coat and pointed ears of his wolf heritage and the loyal temperament of his domestic side. Silas had found him as a pup, half-starved and motherless, caught in a leg trap some careless hunter had abandoned. The decision to keep him hadn't been difficult. Loneliness was a patient predator in these mountains, and even the most self-sufficient man needed something alive to talk to. The dog had repaid that kindness tenfold. Bristle could track game across rock and through streams, could sense weather changes hours before they arrived, and had warned Silas of bears, mountain lions, and the occasional lost hiker who wandered too far from the marked trails. More than that, though, Bristle was company. In the evenings, when the fire burned low and the mountain silence pressed in from all directions, the dog would settle beside Silas's chair, and the old man would rest his hand on that thick fur and feel less alone in the world. Silas's path to this isolated life hadn't been direct. He'd grown up in these same mountains, son of a trapper and mountain man named Jacob McCrae, who'd lived by his own rules and taught his boy to do the same. But young men rarely listened to their father's wisdom, and Silas had been eager to see what lay beyond the peaks that hemmed in his childhood world. At 18, he'd enlisted in the army, serving 2 tours in Vietnam that had shown him more of human nature than any young man should have to see. After the war, he'd tried to fit into normal society. He'd married a good woman named Ellen, taken a job at a lumber mill, bought a house in town with a white picket fence and a lawn that needed mowing every week. For 15 years, he'd played the part of a civilized man, and he'd been genuinely happy for most of it. Ellen had understood his need for space, his long silences, the way he sometimes woke in the middle of the night and stepped outside to breathe. She'd been patient with his hunting trips and fishing expeditions, had even joined him camping in the mountains where he'd grown up. But Ellen had wanted children, and that was a gift Silas couldn't give her. Not because he was unable, the doctors had found nothing wrong with either of them, but because he couldn't bear the thought of bringing a child into a world that contained the things he'd seen in the war. Every time Ellen brought up starting a family, Silas felt something cold and final settle in his chest. He'd seen what happened to children in war zones, had been forced to witness acts that still visited him in dreams. How could he create new life, knowing what human beings were capable of doing to each other? The marriage had ended quietly, without anger or blame. Ellen had deserved better than a man who couldn't give her what she needed, and Silas had known it. She'd remarried within 2 years, to a banker who loved her properly and gave her 3 children who were probably grown by now. Silas had signed the divorce papers and sold the house, keeping only what would fit in his truck. Then he'd driven back into the mountains of his youth and never left again. The cabin had taken him 3 years to build, working mostly alone, except for the occasional help from other mountain dwellers who understood the code of mutual assistance that governed life this far from civilization. He'd chosen the location carefully, close enough to a stream for water, sheltered from the worst weather, but remote enough that he could go weeks without seeing another human being. The nearest town, Bear Creek, lay 15 miles down a barely maintained dirt road that became impassable in winter. That suited Silas fine. He kept a radio for emergencies and made supply runs twice a year, but otherwise the world beyond his mountain could have disappeared for all he cared. His father, Jacob, had died the winter before Silas returned to the mountains, taking with him a lifetime of stories about the old days when trappers and mountain men had been the only white inhabitants of this vast wilderness. Jacob had been part of a generation that lived by different rules. Men who measured wealth in furs and knowledge in survival skills, who could read weather in cloud formations and find their way by stars. Silas regretted not listening more carefully to those stories when he'd had the chance. What haunted him most was how little he knew about his own mother. Jacob had rarely spoken of her, saying only that she died when Silas was born and that talking about her brought too much pain. Silas had a single photograph, a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, holding a baby he assumed was himself. No name, no stories, no sense of where she'd come from or what kind of person she'd been. It was as if half his history had been deliberately erased. Now, standing in his cabin with the morning coffee growing cold in his hands, Silas stared at the yellowed envelope he'd brought back from the cave. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for important correspondence in an earlier era. His father's handwriting was unmistakable. The careful script of a man who'd learned to read and write, despite growing up in the wilderness. The envelope was sealed with red wax that had cracked but held, and it was addressed simply, "For my son, when he is ready." Bristle lay by the fire, but his ears were alert, tracking every small sound from outside. The dog had been agitated since their return from the cave, pacing and whining in a way that was completely unlike his normal calm demeanor. It was as if he sensed that something fundamental had changed, that the discovery in the cave had shifted the careful balance of their isolated world. The cave itself had been a marvel. Hidden behind a curtain of falling water that muffled sound and concealed the entrance from casual observation, it had clearly been used as a cache by someone who understood the value of discretion. The supplies inside were old but well-preserved fur pelts wrapped in oiled canvas, rifles cleaned and greased against rust, bags of gold dust, and silver coins from an era when such currency actually held meaning. Everything had been arranged with military precision, labeled and inventoried in the same careful handwriting that adorned the envelope. But it was more than a treasure cache. It was a glimpse into a world Silas had never known existed, a secret history that had been waiting decades for him to discover it. The dates on the inventory sheets went back 45 years, to a time when Silas had been a young man fighting in a foreign war, while his father had apparently been involved in something far more complex than simple trapping and hunting. The letter seemed to pulse in his hands, demanding attention while simultaneously warning him that some knowledge couldn't be unknown once learned. Silas had spent his adult life accepting that the past was fixed, unchangeable, something to be endured rather than questioned. But now, he held the possibility that everything he thought he knew about his family, his father, and himself might be incomplete or even false. Outside, the wind picked up, sending pine needles skittering across the cabin's roof with a sound like distant rain. Winter would be here soon, bringing the long months of isolation when the snow made travel impossible and the nearest human contact lay buried under 15-foot drifts. If he was going to act on this discovery, it would have to be soon. Bristle raised his head and looked directly at Silas, those intelligent yellow eyes seeming to ask a question. The dog had led him to the cave for a reason, had broken years of predictable behavior to guide him toward this moment. Whatever instinct or inherited memory had driven that behavior, it suggested that the truth contained in the letter was something that needed to be known, regardless of the consequences. Silas set down his coffee cup and walked to the window that faced west, toward the peaks where his father had spent most of his adult life. Somewhere out there lay answers to questions he'd carried for 70 years. The letter in his hands was either the key to understanding his own history or the first step toward destroying the carefully constructed peace he'd built in these mountains. He turned back toward the fire, where Bristle waited with the infinite patience of a creature who understood that some decisions couldn't be rushed. The envelope felt heavier than paper had any right to feel, weighted with the accumulated silence of decades. Whatever truth his father had left for him, it was time to learn whether some secrets were worth keeping. Silas sat in his father's old chair, the one piece of furniture he'd brought from Jacob's cabin after the old man died. The leather was worn smooth in places, cracked in others, but it still held his father's shape somehow, still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and mountain air. The letter lay on the small table beside him, untouched for 3 hours, while he wrestled with the decision to open it. Bristle had given up watching him and dozed by the fire, but even in sleep the dog's ears twitched at every sound. The afternoon light was failing, painting the cabin's interior in shades of gold and amber that would soon give way to the deep purple of mountain twilight. If he was going to do this, it needed to be now, before his courage failed him entirely. The wax seal broke with a sound like a small bone snapping. Inside, he found 3 items that made his breath catch in his throat. The first was a letter written in his father's careful hand, the ink faded but still legible. The second was a photograph he'd never seen before, a group of men in frontier clothing, posed in front of what looked like the very cave he'd discovered that morning. The third was a small leather pouch that clinked when he picked it up. Silas held the photograph closer to the firelight. 6 men, all armed, all wearing the practical clothing of trappers and mountain men. He recognized his father immediately, younger, but unmistakably Jacob McCrae, standing second from the left with a rifle across his chest. The others were strangers, but their faces held the same weathered competence that had marked his father's generation. On the back someone had written, "The Granite Creek Company, 1948. The leather pouch contained a dozen gold nuggets, each roughly the size of a marble, along with something that made Silas's hands tremble. It was a wedding ring, delicate and obviously feminine, set with a small diamond that caught the firelight. Wrapped around the ring was a thin strip of paper with a single word written in fading ink, Maria, his mother's name. After 70 years of not knowing, it was that simple, Maria. With hands that weren't quite steady, Silas unfolded his father's letter and began to read. "Son, if you're reading this, then Bristle found his way to the cave like I always hoped he would. That dog's got more wolf in him than most folks realize, and wolves remember things across generations that men forget. I trained him to know the scent of that place, to lead you there when the time was right. I should have told you about your mother when you were growing up, but I was a coward. Some truths are harder to carry than others, and I thought I was protecting you from pain I couldn't fix. Now I see I was wrong. A man has a right to know where he comes from, even if the story isn't what he hoped for. Your mother wasn't who I told you she was. Maria Santos wasn't my wife, she was my partner. Not in marriage, but in work. The kind of work that decent people don't talk about in polite company. We were smugglers, son, all of us in the Granite Creek Company. We moved gold, silver, sometimes people across borders that government said we couldn't cross. This was different times, when a man with the right skills could make his own rules if he was willing to live outside the law. We had routes through these mountains that no federal marshal knew about, caches like the Sage, one you found scattered across 3 states. Maria was the best of us. She could track like an Apache, shoot like Annie Oakley, and had a mind for planning that kept us all alive more times than I can count. She was also the most beautiful woman I ever saw, with eyes like dark honey, and a laugh that could warm you clear through on the coldest night. We weren't lovers at first. The company didn't allow that kind of complication. But over time, working so close together, sharing dangers and victories, it became something neither of us could fight. We tried to keep it secret, but secrets don't last long among men who depend on each other for survival. When Maria told me she was carrying our child, everything changed. The company had rules about family, about the liability that women and children represented to our operations. Some of the men wanted her gone, sent away somewhere safe until the baby was born, and then permanently separated from our group. They said it was for her own good, for the good of everyone. I fought them on it, but I was outnumbered. The vote was 4-2, and in the company, majority ruled. Maria would have to leave, and if she wouldn't go willingly, they'd make her disappear permanently. These weren't men you crossed lightly, son. They'd all killed before, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again if they thought their survival depended on it. So Maria and I ran. We took what gold we could carry and headed deeper into the mountains, to places even the company didn't know about. We found a hidden valley where we thought we could wait out the winter, have our baby, and figure out what to do next. But the company found us anyway. They always were good trackers. The fight lasted most of a night. Maria was 8 months along by then, heavy with you but still deadly with a rifle. We held them off until dawn, but we both knew it was only a matter of time. They had us surrounded and we were running low on ammunition. That's when Maria made the choice that saved your life and cost her own. She told me to take you and run when she gave the signal, said she'd hold them off long enough for us to get clear, then follow when she could. I knew she was lying. We both knew she wasn't coming after us. But there wasn't time to argue, and there wasn't another choice. You were born that morning, in a cave about 5 miles from where they cornered us. Maria delivered you herself, cut the cord with her skinning knife, and wrapped you in her own coat. Then she kissed you once, kissed me, and told me to make sure you grew up knowing right from wrong. The signal was 3 gunshots close together. When I heard them, I ran like she told me to. I ran with you in my arms, and I didn't stop running until I was sure we were clear. By the time I circled back, it was too late. The company was gone, and so was Maria. I found her body 2 days later, after I'd gotten you to safety with a family in Bear Creek. She'd taken 3 of them with her before they got her. Even outnumbered and wounded, she'd made them pay for what they did. I buried her in that hidden valley, marked the grave with stones arranged in a pattern she'd taught me from her Apache grandmother. Then I took you and left those mountains for good. Started over somewhere new, raised you as best I could, and never looked back. The company disbanded after that. Some of the surviving members moved on to other ventures. Others just disappeared into the wilderness. I heard rumors over the years that they'd all met bad ends, that the law finally caught up with them, that they'd killed each other over the remaining gold. I don't know what's true and what's wishful thinking. What I do know is that you deserved better than a father who was too much of a coward to tell you the truth. Your mother died a hero, son. She died protecting you and making sure you'd have a chance at a life cleaner than the one she and I had chosen. I hope that means something to you. The gold in this cache is yours by right. It's what's left of everything Maria and I accumulated during our years with the company. There's enough there to change your life if you want it to, or to stay hidden forever if you prefer things the way they are. But there's one more thing you need to know. Maria had family, a sister who might still be alive, cousins, maybe even nieces and nephews you've never met. She came from a place called Santos Valley, down in New Mexico. If you want to know more about where you come from, that's where you'd need to start looking. The choice is yours, son. It always has been. Your father, Jacob McCrae. Silas let the letter fall to his lap and stared into the fire until his eyes watered. 70 years of wondering, and the truth was more complex than anything he'd imagined. His mother hadn't died in childbirth from natural causes. She'd died defending him, fighting off men who would have killed them both rather than let them escape. He picked up the photograph again, studying the faces of the Granite Creek Company with new understanding. These weren't simple trappers or mountain men. They were outlaws, men who'd lived outside the law and died by it. His father had been one of them, and so had his mother. Bristle woke and padded over to rest his massive head against Silas's knee, as if sensing the emotional weight of what had just been revealed. The dog's yellow eyes held an ancient intelligence, and Silas found himself wondering what memories might live in that wolf heritage, what instincts had driven Bristle to lead him to this moment of truth. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. Sleep eluded Silas that night. He lay in his narrow bunk listening to the snow accumulate on the cabin roof, each soft thump of settling powder marking time like a slow heartbeat. The letter had changed everything and nothing. He was still the same man in the same cabin, but now he carried the weight of a different history. His mother had a name, a face, a story that painted her as something far more complex than the tragic figure he'd imagined. When dawn finally broke grey and muted through the storm clouds, Silas rose and rebuilt the fire with automatic movements, while his mind wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. The photograph lay on the kitchen table where he'd left it, the 6 members of the Granite Creek Company staring out from their frozen moment in 1948. He studied each face again, trying to read their characters in the set of their jaws and the directness of their gazes. Bristle had spent the night by the door, alert and restless in a way that had become increasingly common since their discovery of the cave. Now he stood and whined softly, nosing at the latch as if he wanted to return to that hidden place behind the waterfall. The dog's behavior suggested there were more secrets waiting to be uncovered, more pieces of the puzzle that needed to be found. After breakfast, Silas bundled himself against the cold and followed Bristle back through the snow toward the cave. The storm had intensified during the night, laying down 6 inches of fresh powder that crunched beneath their boots and muffled the usual sounds of the forest. The waterfall had partially frozen, creating a curtain of ice that made the cave entrance even more concealed than before. Inside, with his battery-powered lantern casting dancing shadows on the rock walls, Silas conducted a more thorough investigation of the cache. What he'd taken for a simple storage depot revealed itself to be far more sophisticated. The back wall of the cave had been modified, with handholds carved into the stone, leading up to a natural shelf about 15 feet above the main floor. On that shelf, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled canvas, he found additional items that his father's letter hadn't mentioned. The first was a detailed map of the southwestern territories, hand-drawn with meticulous accuracy. Routes were marked in different colored inks, with symbols that obviously meant something to the people who'd used them. Supply caches were indicated by small X marks, safe houses by circles, and what appeared to be law enforcement presence by triangular warnings. It was the kind of intelligence network that would have taken years to develop and maintain. The second discovery was a leather-bound journal filled with his mother's handwriting. The entries spanned 3 years, from 1945 to 1948, chronicling the operations of the Granite Creek Company in matter-of-fact prose that revealed Maria Santos as an educated woman with a keen analytical mind. Her observations about terrain, weather patterns, and the movements of federal agents read like military intelligence reports. But scattered throughout the operational notes were personal entries that gave Silas his first real glimpse of his mother as a human being rather than a legend. She wrote about her homesickness for New Mexico, her complicated feelings about the illegal nature of their work, and eventually, her growing love for Jacob McCrae. "Jacob doesn't realize how much he's changed since I've known him," one entry read. "When I first joined the company, he was all business, hard as the granite these mountains are named for. But underneath that armor is a man who feels things deeply, who carries the weight of every decision like stones in his pockets. I see how he watches out for the younger members, how he makes sure everyone gets their fair share, even when supplies run short. He's a better man than he thinks he is." Another passage, dated just weeks before Silas's birth, revealed the depth of her fears about their situation. "The company is fracturing. Tom Brewster has been pushing for more violent solutions to our problems, and some of the others are starting to listen. They talk about eliminating witnesses, about permanent solutions to temporary obstacles. This isn't what I signed up for. Jacob and I need to find a way out before things go too far, but I'm afraid it may already be too late." The name Tom Brewster appeared frequently in the later entries, always in the context of conflict and disagreement. Maria had clearly seen him as a threat to the group's survival and cohesion. In one particularly telling passage, she wrote, "Brewster knows about the baby now. He's been asking questions, making suggestions about what should happen when I'm no longer able to participate in operations. His idea of a solution involves a one-way trip to somewhere I'd never be found. Jacob doesn't know how serious the threat is yet, but I can see it coming like storm clouds on the horizon." Silas found himself gripping the journal tighter as he read, feeling an echo of his mother's fear across the decades. These weren't just historical documents. They were the final thoughts of a woman who'd known she was running out of time, but had fought anyway to give her unborn child a chance at life. The third item on the shelf was the most disturbing, a collection of wanted posters bearing the faces of the Granite Creek Company members. Federal marshals had been tracking them for months before the final confrontation, offering substantial rewards for their capture. The poster featuring his parents showed them together, identified as Jacob McCrae and Maria Santos, suspected of interstate smuggling operations and multiple federal crimes. But it was the dates on the posters that made Silas's blood run cold. They were issued 2 weeks before he was born, which meant the law had been closing in just as his parents were trying to escape the company. They'd been caught between their former partners and federal agents, with nowhere safe to run and a baby on the way. As he climbed back down from the shelf, Silas noticed something he'd missed during his first visit to the cave. Near the entrance, partially hidden behind a stack of supply boxes, someone had carved words into the rock wall. The inscription was simple but profound. "For my son, may he choose a better path. M.S. Maria Santos had left him a message, carved in stone where it would last longer than paper or memory. Even in her final weeks, facing impossible odds and knowing she might not survive, she'd thought about his future and the choices he would someday need to make. The weight of that love, reaching across 70 years of silence, nearly brought him to his knees. Bristle appeared at his side, pressing his warm bulk against Silas's leg as if sensing his emotional turmoil. The dog had been more than usually attentive since the discovery of the cave, as if he understood that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. Perhaps that wolf heritage carried memories that went deeper than human understanding, connecting him to this place and its secrets in ways that couldn't be explained. Outside, the storm was intensifying, but Silas barely noticed the cold as he made his way back to the cabin with his new discoveries. The journal and map represented more than historical artifacts. They were roadmaps to understanding who his mother had been and where she'd come from. The reference to Santos Valley in New Mexico suddenly took on new significance. If Maria had family there, if any of her people still lived in that place, then he had connections to a world he'd never known existed. But pursuing those connections would mean leaving the mountains that had been his refuge for more than 2 decades. It would mean confronting a past that might not welcome his intrusion, and possibly learning truths that would be harder to bear than the silence he'd lived with all his life. Back in the warmth of his cabin, Silas spread the map on his kitchen table and began to study the routes his parents had used in their desperate flight from both the law and their former partners. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping Silas in the cabin with his mother's journal and his own turbulent thoughts. He read every entry twice, then 3 times, absorbing the details of Maria Santos's life like a man dying of thirst. Each page revealed new facets of a woman who had been far more complex than anything he'd imagined during his 70 years of wandering. Maria had been educated, her entries revealing knowledge of literature, history, and mathematics that would have been unusual for a woman of her era, especially one involved in outlaw activities. She wrote about missing books from her father's library in Santos Valley, about conversations with her Apache grandmother who had taught her tracking skills that later proved invaluable to the company's operations. But what struck Silas most profoundly were her moral struggles with the work they were doing. Unlike some of the other members, Maria hadn't entered the smuggling business purely for profit. Her entries revealed a woman who saw their activities as a form of resistance against laws she considered unjust, particularly those restricting the movement of Mexican families across borders that had been arbitrarily drawn through their ancestral territories. "The government tells us these are crimes," she wrote in one passage. "But how is it criminal to help a family reunite when politicians have decided that invisible lines matter more than blood ties? We move gold and silver, yes, but we also move people who have been separated from their children, their parents, their lives. If that makes us outlaws, then perhaps being an outlaw is more honorable than being law-abiding." The journal also provided insights into the dynamics that had ultimately destroyed the Granite Creek Company. Tom Brewster emerged as an increasingly volatile figure who had joined the group for purely mercenary reasons. His entries in Maria's observations painted him as a man who enjoyed the violence and power that came with their illegal activities, someone who saw other people as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving of consideration. Brewster shot a federal agent today during what should have been a routine avoidance maneuver, Maria had written in one of her final entries. "The man was alone, probably just a scout, and we could have easily evaded him without bloodshed. But Tom said he was tired of running and hiding, that it was time to send a message. Jacob is furious, and rightly so. Murder changes everything. We're no longer just smugglers, we're cop killers now, and that means they'll never stop hunting us." That entry was dated just 3 weeks before Silas's birth, confirming that his parents had been caught in an impossible situation. The company was dissolving into violence and paranoia, while federal law enforcement was closing in with the kind of determination reserved for those who'd crossed the ultimate line. When the storm finally cleared, Silas made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. He would go to New Mexico. The journal contained enough clues about Santos Valley's location to guide him there, and Maria's references to family suggested there might still be people alive who remembered her. At 70, he was probably too old for such a journey, but the alternative, living with incomplete knowledge for whatever years remained to him, felt like a betrayal of the courage his mother had shown in her final days. The practical challenges were substantial. His truck was reliable enough for mountain roads, but a 1,000-mile journey to the southwest would test both the vehicle and his own physical limitations. More problematically, he'd been off the grid for so long that he wasn't sure his identification documents were still valid. The world beyond the mountains had changed dramatically during his decades of self-imposed exile, and navigating modern bureaucracy might prove more challenging than surviving in the wilderness. But Bristle had solved one problem by creating another. The dog's increasingly restless behavior suggested he sensed something that Silas couldn't perceive. On the morning after the storm cleared, Bristle had led him not toward the cave, but in the opposite direction, following a game trail that wound deeper into the mountains than Silas had ever explored. After an hour of climbing through knee-deep snow, they'd emerged onto a ridge that offered a view of valleys and peaks stretching to the southern horizon. Bristle had stood at the edge of that vista for nearly 10 minutes, motionless except for his ears, which swiveled constantly as if tracking sounds too distant for human perception. When he finally turned to look at Silas, his yellow eyes held an urgency that couldn't be ignored. Whatever instinct or inherited memory was driving the dog's behavior, it was pointing them toward a specific destination. That evening, Silas spread his father's collection of topographical maps across the kitchen table and began planning a route south. The modern interstate system had bypassed most of the routes the Granite Creek Company had used, but the old roads still existed, winding through mountain passes and desert valleys that hadn't changed much since 1948. If he avoided major cities and stuck to rural highways, he might be able to make the journey without attracting unwanted attention. The logistics of leaving the cabin for an extended period required careful consideration. The water system would need to be drained to prevent freeze damage, the generator would need to be secured, and arrangements would have to be made for the inevitable emergencies that struck isolated properties when their owners were absent. More challenging was the question of what to do about the cave and its contents. The gold and artifacts represented a fortune in both monetary and historical terms, but they also represented evidence of federal crimes that might still be prosecutable under the law. Silas's solution was characteristically practical. He would take enough gold to finance the journey and leave the rest hidden where it had remained safe for decades. The journal and photograph would come with him as proof of his identity should he encounter Maria's family. The map of smuggling routes he would destroy. That information was too dangerous to preserve, and the people who had used those routes were either dead or had long since moved on to other lives. But as he made these preparations, a nagging concern grew in the back of his mind. The journal's final entries suggested that not all members of the Granite Creek Company had died during the dissolution of the group. If Tom Brewster or any of the others had survived, they might still be alive, might still remember the location of the cache, might still consider it their property despite the decades that had passed. Worse, Maria's family in Santos Valley might not welcome an unexpected visitor claiming to be the son of a woman who had died under violent circumstances. Her departure from New Mexico to join an outlaw band would have brought shame to her family, and her subsequent death might have been something they preferred to forget rather than remember. The smart choice would be to stay in the mountains, to let sleeping dogs lie, and continue the quiet life he'd built for himself. But as he looked at Bristle, now sleeping peacefully by the fire after days of restless agitation, Silas realized that some journeys couldn't be avoided. His mother had risked everything to give him life. The least he could do was risk his comfortable isolation to honor her memory by learning where she'd come from. The preparation for leaving the mountains took 2 weeks, each day bringing new complications that Silas hadn't anticipated after 23 years of self-sufficiency. His first shock came during a supply run to Bear Creek, where he discovered that his driver's license had expired 15 years earlier and his social security records listed him as deceased, apparently a bureaucratic error that no one had bothered to correct since he'd never filed taxes or accessed government services. Frank Holloway, who ran the general store and served as Bear Creek's unofficial information broker, listened to Silas's predicament with the patient attention of a man who'd seen most varieties of human trouble pass through his doors. At 65, Frank was one of the few people in town who remembered when Silas had first retreated to the mountains, and he'd always respected the old man's choice to live apart from society's complications. "Getting yourself legally alive again is going to take some doing," Frank admitted, scratching his grey beard thoughtfully. "But I know a lady down in Casper who handles these kinds of situations for folks who've been off the grid. She used to work for the state, understands how to navigate the system without raising too many questions. It'll cost you, though." The cost turned out to be more than money. Establishing his legal existence required forms, documentation, and a trail of evidence that proved he was who he claimed to be. Silas had his military discharge papers, fortunately stored in a waterproof container, but everything else, birth certificate, marriage license, divorce decree, had been lost or abandoned during his retreat from civilization. More problematically, obtaining new identification would require him to provide a permanent address, which meant either lying on federal documents or revealing the location of his mountain refuge. Both options carried risks he wasn't comfortable accepting, but the alternative was attempting to travel 1,000 miles through a modern surveillance state without proper papers. The bureaucratic lady in Casper, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Wells, offered a solution that felt like making a deal with a necessary devil. She could expedite the paperwork for a substantial fee, but it would require Silas to maintain the fiction that he'd been living in Bear Creek all along, working odd jobs and staying under the radar by choice rather than circumstance. The key, Patricia explained during their uncomfortable meeting in her cluttered office, is creating a plausible backstory that explains the gaps without raising red flags. "You were a reclusive veteran who preferred cash work and minimal government interaction, perfectly legal, if unusual. The trick is making sure all the dates and locations align with records that already exist." While waiting for his paperwork to be processed, Silas found himself staying in Bear Creek's only motel, a depressing collection of rooms that smelled like old cigarettes and industrial disinfectant. Bristle adapted to their temporary urban exile with the same stoic patience he showed toward all circumstances beyond his control, but Silas chafed at the enforced inactivity and the constant presence of other people. The town itself had changed during his years of absence, though not necessarily for the better. The mining company that had provided most of the area's employment had closed down 5 years earlier, leaving behind a population of retirees, welfare recipients, and the kind of desperate individuals who ended up in places like Bear Creek because they couldn't afford to live anywhere else. But the experience of being around people again, however briefly, reminded Silas how much he'd lost during his decades of isolation. Conversations in the diner revealed that Frank Holloway's grandson had been killed in Afghanistan, that the schoolteacher everyone remembered from 20 years ago was now dying of cancer, that the bright young couple who'd opened the hardware store had lost it to bankruptcy and divorce. Life had continued in his absence, bringing both joy and tragedy to people he'd once known as neighbors. More disturbing were the changes in technology and social behavior that made him feel like a visitor from an earlier century. Everyone carried phones that did more than make calls, conducted business through computer networks he didn't understand, and seemed to live their lives in public through something called social media. The simple act of buying groceries now required navigating electronic systems that baffled him completely. Patricia Wells had warned him that traveling with Bristle would present additional complications, since the dog's wolf heritage made him technically illegal in many jurisdictions. Modern animal control laws were far more restrictive than they'd been during Silas's younger years, and a 70-pound animal that looked more wolf than dog was likely to attract unwanted attention from authorities. The solution came from an unexpected source. Doc Martinez, Bear Creek's aging veterinarian, had been treating Bristle's occasional injuries for years and was familiar with the dog's unusual heritage. For a reasonable fee and no questions asked, he provided documentation identifying Bristle as a northern breed mix with current vaccinations and health. certificates that would satisfy most casual inspections. "That's a good dog you've got there," Doc Martinez observed as he completed the paperwork. "Smart as any, I've seen, and loyal in ways that most people don't understand anymore. Dogs like that don't come around often, and when they do, they usually attach themselves to people who need them most. You take care of each other." The advice proved prophetic when Silas's truck broke down 3 days before his departure date. The aging Ford's transmission finally surrendered to decades of mountain roads and neglect, leaving him stranded in Bear Creek with no reliable means of transportation and a rapidly dwindling budget for unexpected expenses. Frank Holloway's solution was typically practical and came with strings attached. His nephew in Denver had a used car lot and owed Frank several favors accumulated over years of family politics. The nephew would provide Silas with a reliable vehicle at cost, but only if Silas agreed to deliver a package to someone in Albuquerque during his journey south. "Nothing illegal," Frank assured him, "just some paperwork that needs to reach a business associate without going through regular mail. The kind of transaction that works better when conducted face-to-face. If you understand my meaning." Silas understood enough to know he was being drawn into complications he'd prefer to avoid, but his alternatives were limited. The package, a thick manila envelope sealed with tape, felt like documents rather than contraband, and the address in Albuquerque was only slightly out of his way to Santos Valley. More concerning was the realization that accepting Frank's help made him beholden to networks of obligation and favor that extended far beyond Bear Creek. Rural communities operated on complex systems of mutual assistance that could bind a man to responsibilities he'd never explicitly agreed to accept. By taking Frank's help, Silas was acknowledging that he might someday be expected to return comparable assistance, regardless of his desire to remain uninvolved in other people's business. But with his new identification documents finally approved and a dependable vehicle arranged, the practical obstacles to his journey were mostly resolved. Patricia Wells had done her work thoroughly, providing him with a driver's license, social security card, and even a credit history that would pass casual scrutiny. The fiction of his life in Bear Creek was now officially documented, creating a legal existence that felt strangely inauthentic despite being technically accurate. The night before his departure, Silas sat in his motel room, reading his mother's journal one final time, trying to memorize details that might prove important when he reached Santos Valley. The journey south began at dawn on a crystalline October morning, with Bristle riding shotgun in Frank's nephew's carefully selected replacement vehicle, a 10-year-old Chevy pickup with enough miles to be affordable but not enough to be unreliable. The truck had 4-wheel drive, decent gas mileage, and the kind of anonymous appearance that wouldn't attract attention in either rural areas or city traffic. Silas had plotted a route that avoided major interstates in favor of state highways and county roads, following roughly the same paths his parents might have taken during their desperate flight 70 years earlier. The modern landscape bore little resemblance to the wilderness described in his mother's journal, but the underlying geography remained unchanged. The same mountain passes, river valleys, and desert basins that had provided concealment for the Granite Creek Company's operations. His first stop came sooner than expected. 50 miles south of Bear Creek, a roadside historical marker caught his attention with its reference to frontier-era smuggling routes that had connected mining territories with markets in Mexico and California. The display included a map showing 2 approximate locations of known outlaw hideouts, and Silas recognized several landmarks mentioned in Maria's journal. But what made him pull over was a photograph included in the historical display, a group of federal marshals posed with recovered contraband from a raid conducted in 1949. The cache looked remarkably similar to what Silas had found in the cave, and the accompanying text mentioned that several suspects had escaped capture and were never apprehended. The timing was perfect. The raid had occurred 18 months after Silas's birth, suggesting that federal law enforcement had continued pursuing the Granite Creek Company even after Maria's death and Jacob's disappearance. Someone had kept the investigation active, which meant there were probably official records that might contain information about his parents' final months. Bristle grew increasingly restless as they drove through landscape that grew progressively more arid and open. The dog spent most of the trip standing with his front paws on the dashboard, watching the horizon with an intensity that suggested recognition rather than simple curiosity. Whatever genetic memories or inherited instincts governed his behavior, they were clearly responding to environmental cues that Silas couldn't perceive. Their overnight stop in a small Colorado town called Las Animas provided an unexpected connection to his family's history. The elderly desk clerk at the local motel, a weathered woman named Rose Delgado, took one look at Silas and asked if he was related to the Santos family from New Mexico. "You've got the look," she explained when Silas expressed surprise at her question. "That combination of features, the bone structure, the way you carry yourself. I knew Maria Santos when we were girls. She used to visit relatives here every summer until she got mixed up with those smugglers and disappeared." Rose's memories of Maria painted a picture that complemented, but differed, from the journal. Entries Silas had been reading, where Maria's own writing revealed a thoughtful, conflicted woman struggling with moral complexities. Rose remembered a spirited girl who chafed at traditional expectations and dreamed of adventures beyond the boundaries of family and community obligations. "She was smart as a whip and twice as quick," Rose recalled as they sat in the motel's small lobby after Silas had checked in for the night. But she had this restless energy that made her parents worry. Girls weren't supposed to want the kinds of things Maria wanted: travel, independence, the right to make her own choices about marriage and family. When she left Santos Valley to join that outlaw group, it broke her family's heart. But it didn't surprise anybody who really knew her. The conversation revealed details that hadn't appeared in any of the documents Silas had found. Maria had been engaged to a local rancher's son when she disappeared, a conventional marriage that would have provided security but little personal fulfillment. Her decision to break that engagement and leave with the Granite Creek Company had caused a scandal that reverberated through Santos Valley for years. Her sister Carmen tried to defend her. Rose continued, said Maria had every right to choose her own path, even if other people didn't understand it. But their father, he was a proud man. Very traditional, he said Maria was dead to him the day she left. Wouldn't let anyone mention her name in his house ever again. This information created new anxieties about Silas's planned arrival in Santos Valley. If Maria's family had disowned her, they might not welcome her son's sudden appearance 7 decades later. Worse, his resemblance to Maria might reopen old wounds that the family preferred to keep closed. But Rose had more encouraging news as well. Carmen Santos had married and raised a large family in Santos Valley, and several of her children and grandchildren still lived in the area. Unlike their grandfather, they had always been curious about their lost aunt and might be more receptive to contact from her son. Carmen's oldest granddaughter runs the local historical society now, Rose informed him. Elena Vasquez. She's been collecting stories about the old days, trying to preserve the history before all the old-timers die off. She's asked me about Maria more than once, wanting to know what I remembered. The name gave Silas a specific person to contact when he reached Santos Valley, someone who might be genuinely interested in learning about Maria's fate rather than defensive about family shame. It also suggested that his mother's story hadn't been completely erased from local memory, despite her father's attempt to make her persona non grata. That night, alone in the generic motel room with Bristle sprawled across the foot of the bed, Silas reread the sections of Maria's journal that dealt with her family background. Her writing revealed deep love for her, the sister Carmen, and genuine grief about the pain her choices would cause her parents. But it also showed unwavering conviction that traditional roles would have destroyed something essential in her nature. "I cannot be the woman they want me to be," Maria had written shortly before joining the company, that woman would be safe, respectable, and miserable. I would rather live dangerously and authentically than safely and falsely. Carmen understands this, even if she cannot follow the same path. Perhaps someday she will forgive me for choosing freedom over family expectations. The passage suggested that Maria had hoped to maintain some connection with her family despite her unconventional choices. Her death had prevented any possibility of reconciliation, but it also meant that her family had never learned the full truth about her final years or the courage she'd shown in protecting her son. As Silas drifted towards sleep, he found himself wondering whether his journey would provide closure or merely open old wounds that had finally begun to heal. The closer he got to Santos Valley, the more complex his mission became. He was no longer simply seeking information about his mother's background. He was carrying news of her death to people who might prefer their memories unmarked by additional tragedy. But Bristle's increasingly alert behavior suggested that something significant awaited them at the end of their journey, something that went beyond simple family reunion or historical curiosity. The dog's wolf heritage seemed to be responding to stimuli that transcended ordinary understanding, guiding them toward a destination that felt more like destiny than choice. Santos Valley revealed itself gradually as Silas descended from the high desert plateaus of northern New Mexico, first as a distant smudge of green in an otherwise brown landscape, then as a genuine oasis of cottonwoods and irrigated fields nestled between red rock mesas. The approach matched his mother's journal descriptions perfectly, confirming that he'd found the right destination despite decades of change and modernization. The town itself was smaller than he'd expected, perhaps 2,000 residents clustered around a traditional plaza that had probably looked much the same when Maria Santos was a girl. Adobe buildings with thick walls and small windows lined streets that followed the Spanish colonial grid pattern, while newer construction sprawled outward in the characteristic randomness of 20th century development. Silas found the historical society in a converted Victorian mansion that seemed oddly out of place among the southwestern architecture. Elena Vasquez turned out to be a woman in her 40s, with the kind of steady competence that made her seem both approachable and formidable. When Silas introduced himself and explained his connection to Maria Santos, her reaction was immediate and intense. "My God," she whispered, studying his face with the focused attention of someone comparing it to a mental photograph. "You have her eyes. And her hands, I've seen pictures where she's holding things, and you hold yourself exactly the same way." Elena's office was filled with carefully organized boxes of documents, photographs, and artifacts from Santos Valley's past. She moved through the collection with practiced efficiency, pulling out materials related to the Santos family while explaining her long-standing interest in Maria's story. "Your mother was something of a local legend," Elena explained, as she arranged photographs on her desk. "The girl who refused to be tamed, who chose adventure over security and paid the ultimate price for her independence. Some people remember her as a cautionary tale about what happens when women step outside traditional roles. Others see her as a pioneer who was simply born in the wrong era." The photographs Elena had collected painted a comprehensive picture of Maria's early life. School pictures showed a serious young woman with intelligent eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw. Family portraits revealed her standing slightly apart from her parents and sister, as if already preparing to step outside the frame of conventional expectations. But it was Elena's next revelation that changed everything Silas thought he knew about his journey. "I have to tell you," Elena said carefully, "you're not the first person to come looking for information about Maria Santos. About 3 months ago, I had another visitor asking very similar questions." She pulled out a business card that made Silas's blood run cold. The name printed on expensive cardstock read, "Thomas Brewster, Jr., Private Investigator," with a Denver address and phone number. Below that, someone had written in pencil, "Seeking information about Granite Creek Company survivors and their descendants, Tom Brewster's son." The man whose father had killed Silas's mother was still alive, and he was actively searching for information about the company's remaining secrets. The implications were staggering and terrifying. "He seemed like a nice enough gentleman," Elena continued, apparently not noticing Silas's distress. "Said he was researching his father's involvement with a group of mountain men back in the 40s and 50s. Claimed his father had told him stories about the old days, and he wanted to verify some details for a family history project." Silas's mind raced through the possibilities. If Tom Brewster Sr. was still alive, he would be nearly 90 years old, but certainly capable of directing his son's research efforts. More likely, the old outlaw had recently died and left behind information that had prompted his son to investigate the family's criminal past. Either way, the younger Brewster's interest in the Granite Creek Company suggested he knew about the cache in the cave and was trying to track down any remaining evidence or witnesses. "What kind of information was he looking for?" Silas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mostly the same things you're interested in: family connections, what happened to the people who left Santos Valley during that period, whether anyone had maintained contact with the folks who got mixed up in smuggling operations." I told him what I knew, which wasn't much more than local gossip and family stories. Elena's innocent cooperation had potentially placed both herself and Silas in danger. If the younger Brewster was following his father's trail, he would eventually trace Silas's parents to their final confrontation and the cave where the company's remaining wealth was hidden. The fact that he was starting his investigation in Santos Valley suggested he already knew more than Elena realized. "Did he leave any contact information besides this business card?" Silas asked. "Actually, he did something rather odd," Elena replied, pulling out a manila folder. "He left a sealed envelope and asked me to give it to anyone else who came, looking for information about Maria Santos or the other people who left the valley during that time. Said it was important that certain family members receive information that could only be safely shared under specific circumstances. The envelope was thick, expensive paper, similar to what his father had used for the letter in the cave. Silas's name was written on the outside in the same careful script that had appeared on the business card, suggesting that Thomas Brewster Jr. had been expecting his arrival in Santos Valley. Inside, he found a letter that sent chills down his spine. "Mr. McCrae," it began, "if you are reading this, then my research has been successful and you have followed the same trail that led me to Santos Valley. I believe we have much to discuss regarding our father's shared history and certain unfinished business that has remained dormant for 70 years. My father, Thomas Brewster Sr., died 6 months ago at the age of 89. Among his effects, I found detailed records of the Granite Creek Company's operations, including maps, financial ledgers, and correspondence that shed new light on the events of 1948. These documents reveal information about your parents' final months that contradict certain assumptions you may have formed based on incomplete evidence. Specifically, my father maintained that Jacob McCrae and Maria Santos were not innocent victims of company dissolution, but active participants in a conspiracy to steal the group's accumulated wealth and eliminate anyone who might oppose their plan. According to his account, your parents initiated the violence that led to the company's destruction, and your mother's death was the result of her own betrayal rather than heroic self-sacrifice. I understand these accusations are serious and potentially distressing. However, I believe both our families deserve to know the complete truth about what happened during those final weeks in 1948. More importantly, there are practical matters to resolve regarding property that belongs legally to the surviving descendants of company members. I will be staying at the Desert Rose Motel in Santos Valley for the next week, hoping to arrange a meeting that will be beneficial to both our interests. The alternative to voluntary cooperation may prove less pleasant for all concerned. Respectfully, Thomas Brewster Jr. The letter's cordial tone couldn't disguise its underlying threat. Brewster was claiming that Silas's parents had been thieves and murderers rather than victims, and he was demanding access to the cash as compensation for his father's alleged losses. The reference to less pleasant alternatives suggested he was prepared to use force or legal action if Silas refused to cooperate. Elena watched with growing concern as Silas read the letter, her historian's instincts recognizing that she'd become involved in something far more complex than simple genealogical research. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In a sense, he had. The ghost of Tom Brewster Sr. was reaching across 7 decades to continue the conflict that had destroyed the Granite Creek Company and killed Silas's mother. But this time, the stakes weren't just survival, they were the truth about Maria Santos's final act and the legacy she'd tried to leave for her son. Bristle, who had been lying quietly beside Elena's desk, suddenly raised his head and growled low in his throat. Through the Historical Society's front window, a black SUV with tinted windows had just pulled up to the curb, and a well-dressed man was stepping out onto the sidewalk. Thomas Brewster Jr. had apparently grown tired of waiting for Silas to contact him voluntarily. Thomas Brewster Jr. was not what Silas had expected. Instead of the rough-edged outlaw scion he'd imagined, the man who walked through the Historical Society's front door was polished, professional, and carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way through negotiation rather than intimidation. He wore an expensive suit that managed to look appropriate for both business meetings and southwestern travel, and his handshake was firm without being aggressive. "Mr. McCrae," he said with genuine warmth, "I'm so pleased we finally have the opportunity to meet, Thomas Brewster, but please call me Tom. I believe our families have quite a history to discuss." Elena Vasquez looked back and forth between the two men with the wary expression of someone who'd suddenly realized she was caught in the middle of a situation she didn't understand. Bristle remained tense, his hackles slightly raised despite the newcomer's friendly demeanor. The dog's instincts were apparently unimpressed by polished manners. "Perhaps we could find a more private location for our conversation," Tom suggested, glancing meaningfully at Elena. "I have some documents in my vehicle that might help clarify certain historical discrepancies." Silas found himself in an impossible position. Refusing to meet with Brewster would accomplish nothing except to antagonize someone who clearly knew more about the Granite Creek Company than he'd revealed in his letter. But agreeing to a private meeting meant isolating himself with a man whose father had murdered his mother, regardless of how civilized the son appeared to be. "Actually," Elena interrupted, "why don't we use the conference room here? I'd be happy to provide some privacy while staying available if either of you needs anything." Her suggestion was diplomatic and practical, offering a compromise that provided both privacy and security. More importantly, it kept their conversation on neutral ground with a witness nearby. Tom considered the proposal for a moment, then nodded agreeably. "That sounds perfect. I appreciate your hospitality, Miss Vasquez." The Historical Society's conference room was a small space dominated by a rectangular table surrounded by mismatched chairs. Elena retreated to her office but left the door open, providing the illusion of privacy while maintaining a clear line of sight to the proceedings. Bristle positioned himself in the doorway, effectively blocking any quick exit while keeping both men under observation. Tom began by spreading documents across the conference table with the methodical precision of a lawyer presenting evidence. The papers included photocopies of what appeared to be original Granite Creek Company, records, financial ledgers, operational reports, and correspondence that provided an insider's view of the organization's final months. "My father kept meticulous records," Tom explained, as he organized the materials. "Perhaps too meticulous for a man involved in illegal activities, but his attention to detail has proven invaluable for understanding what really happened in 1948. The documents painted a picture that was more complex than anything Silas had gleaned from his mother's journal, According to Brewster Sr.'s records, the Granite Creek Company had been facing serious internal conflicts for months before the final confrontation. Federal pressure was increasing, profits were declining, and several members were advocating for either disbanding the organization or transitioning to more violent criminal activities. "Your parents weren't innocent victims," Tom said, his tone remaining conversational despite the inflammatory nature of his words. "According to my father's account, they were planning to disappear with a substantial portion of the company's accumulated wealth. The pregnancy provided perfect cover for their exit strategy. Who would suspect a couple planning to start a family of elaborate theft?" Silas studied the documents Tom was displaying, looking for evidence that would support or contradict these accusations. The paperwork appeared authentic, complete with dates, signatures, and details that would have been difficult to fabricate, but authenticity didn't necessarily mean accuracy, and he knew that Thomas Brewster Sr. would have had every reason to create a record that justified his own actions. "My father claimed that Jacob McCrae and Maria Santos initiated the violence that destroyed the company," Tom continued. "When confronted about the missing gold, they chose to fight rather than negotiate. The other members were forced to defend themselves and their legitimate property rights." "That's not what I read in my mother's journal," Silas replied carefully. "Her account suggests your father was the one pushing for violent solutions to the company's problems." Tom's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes that reminded Silas uncomfortably of a predator evaluating prey. "Journals can be edited, Mr. McCrae. People tend to present themselves favorably when writing for posterity, but financial records are harder to falsify, and the numbers don't lie." He produced a ledger that showed systematic withdrawals of gold and cash from company accounts during the weeks leading up to the final confrontation. The withdrawals were authorized by signatures that appeared to match those on other documents bearing Jacob McCrae's name. "Your father was embezzling from his partners," Tom stated flatly. "Small amounts at first, then increasingly large sums as he prepared for his disappearance with your mother. When the other members discovered what was happening, they demanded an accounting. That's when the shooting started." Silas felt the ground shifting beneath his understanding of his parents' story. If Tom's documents were genuine, then Jacob McCrae had been stealing from the company, and Maria's pregnancy had provided convenient motivation for their planned escape. The heroic narrative of his mother's final sacrifice would be replaced by a sordid tale of greed and betrayal. But something about Tom's presentation bothered him. The man was too prepared, too confident, too eager to share information that painted Silas's parents in the worst possible light. More troubling was the way he kept returning to the subject of the missing wealth, suggesting that his interest in historical accuracy was secondary to recovering what he considered stolen property. "Assuming your version of events is correct," Silas said, "what exactly do you want from me? My parents are dead, and anything they might have stolen would have disappeared 70 years ago." Tom's smile broadened, and for the first time since entering the building, he looked genuinely pleased. "That's where you're wrong, Mr. McCrae. The wealth didn't disappear, it was hidden. My father spent decades searching for the cache your parents established before their deaths. He never found it, but his research identified several possible locations. Recently, I've had reason to believe that the cache has been discovered and that you might have information about its current status." The implication was clear. Tom Brewster Jr. knew or suspected that Silas had found the cave and its contents. The question was how he'd acquired that knowledge and what he planned to do with it. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," Silas replied, though his caution was probably confirmation enough for someone watching his reactions carefully. "I'm suggesting that we have an opportunity to resolve an old injustice," Tom said, leaning forward slightly. "If the missing company assets have been recovered, then they should be returned to the rightful owners, the surviving members or their descendants. I'm prepared to offer you a generous finder's fee in exchange for your cooperation in recovering what belongs to my family." The offer sounded reasonable on the surface, But Silas understood the underlying threat. Tom was claiming legal ownership of the gold and other valuables in the cave, based on his father's membership in the Granite Creek Company. If Silas refused to cooperate voluntarily, Tom was prepared to pursue legal action or other methods of persuasion. "And if I told you I don't know anything about any cash or hidden wealth," Silas asked, "then I'd say you were being unwise," Tom replied, his pleasant demeanor finally showing cracks. "I've invested considerable time and money in researching this matter, Mr. McCrae. I know about your recent trips to Bear Creek to establish legal identification. I know about your sudden departure from decades of isolation to travel to Santos Valley. I know about the unusual behavior of your dog, which my research suggests has wolf heritage that might make him sensitive to environmental cues in specific locations." The depth of Tom's surveillance was chilling. He'd been tracking Silas's movements for weeks, possibly months, building a comprehensive picture of his activities and motivations. The trip to Santos Valley hadn't been a private journey of discovery. It had been a carefully monitored expedition, with Tom watching every step. "You've been following me," Silas stated. "I've been protecting my interests," Tom corrected. "Just as I'm sure you'd protect yours if the situation were reversed. The question now is whether we can reach an agreement that serves both our needs, or whether this matter will require more formal resolution." Elena's voice cut through the tension from her office doorway. "Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt, but we're closing in 15 minutes. Her intervention provided a welcome break in what had become an increasingly uncomfortable conversation. Tom gathered his documents with practiced efficiency, but his movements suggested he considered the meeting far from concluded. "Perhaps we could continue this discussion over dinner," he suggested. "I'm staying at the Desert Rose Motel, as mentioned in my letter. There's a restaurant there that serves excellent regional cuisine." "I need time to consider what you've shown me," Silas replied. "Of course, but don't take too much time, Mr. McCrae. Opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation have a tendency to expire when left unresolved too long." As Tom headed for the door, he paused to address Elena directly. "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Vasquez. I hope our business here won't cause any disruption to your valuable work preserving local history." The comment was polite, but carried an undertone of warning that made Elena visibly uncomfortable. After Tom left, she locked the front door and turned to face Silas with obvious concern. "I don't think that man is really interested in family history," she said quietly, "and I'm starting to worry that I've gotten you involved in something dangerous." That evening, Silas sat in his truck in the parking lot of the Desert Rose Motel, watching Tom Brewster's black SUV through the windshield while wrestling with decisions that could determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. Bristle lay across the passenger seat, alert but calm, his breathing steady despite the tension radiating from his human companion. The documents Tom had shown him that afternoon had shaken Silas's understanding of his parents' story, but something about the man's presentation continued to bother him. The evidence was too convenient, too perfectly organized to support a narrative that painted Jacob McCrae and Maria Santos as thieves and murderers. More troubling was Tom's obvious knowledge of Silas's recent activities, suggesting surveillance that went far beyond casual investigation. Elena Vasquez had provided additional context during their conversation after Tom's departure. Her research into Santos Valley's history had uncovered references to Thomas Brewster Sr. that painted him as a violent, unstable individual who'd been suspected of multiple murders even before joining the Granite Creek Company. Local law enforcement records from the 1942nd contained witness statements describing him as someone who enjoyed killing and was increasingly difficult for his partners to control. "If what you've told me about your mother's journal is accurate," Elena had said, "then her version of events makes much more sense than his son's claims. Your parents were probably trying to escape a situation that was becoming too dangerous to survive." But Elena's support didn't solve Silas's immediate problem. Tom Brewster Jr., clearly knew about the cave and its contents, and he was prepared to use force if negotiation failed. The polite facade he'd maintained during their meeting would disappear quickly if Silas continued to deny knowledge of the missing wealth. Silas had considered simply leaving Santos Valley immediately, but Tom's surveillance capabilities made escape unlikely. The man had tracked him from Wyoming to New Mexico and probably had resources that would allow him to follow wherever Silas might flee. Running would only delay the inevitable confrontation while sacrificing any advantage that might come from choosing the time and place of their final meeting. The alternative was to meet Tom's demands and lead him to the cave, hoping that access to the gold would satisfy his claims and end his pursuit. But that strategy assumed Tom would honor his agreement once he had what he wanted, an assumption that seemed increasingly naive, given the man's obvious capacity for deception and manipulation. A third option had occurred to Silas during his hours of planning, but it carried risks that might prove worse than cooperation or flight. If Tom's documents were forgeries designed to support a false narrative about the Granite Creek Company's dissolution, then exposing that deception might undermine his legal claims to the hidden wealth. But proving forgery would require access to original records that might no longer exist, and the process could take months or years to resolve through proper legal channels. As if summoned by Silas's thoughts, Tom emerged from his motel room and walked directly toward the truck. He moved with the confident stride of a man who'd already won his argument and was simply collecting his prize. Bristle growled low in his throat, but Silas placed a restraining hand on the dog's neck. "Good evening, Mr. McCrae," Tom said as he approached the driver's side window. "I was hoping you'd decided to accept my dinner invitation." "I've been thinking about what you showed me today," Silas replied. "Some of it doesn't add up." Tom's smile tightened slightly, but his tone remained conversational. "I understand your reluctance to accept unflattering information about your parents. Family legends are powerful things, and the truth can be disappointing when it conflicts with what we'd prefer to believe." "It's not about preference," Silas said. "It's about inconsistencies in your evidence. The dates on some of your father's records don't match what I found in my mother's journal, and the handwriting on the financial documents looks too consistent for papers that were supposedly created over several months." For the first time since their initial meeting, Tom's pleasant demeanor showed genuine cracks. His jaw tightened, and his eyes took on the predatory focus that Silas had glimpsed earlier. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. McCrae. I've been more than generous in offering you a partnership in recovering what belongs to me. That generosity has limits." "What belongs to you?" Silas asked. "Even if your father's version of events were true, which I doubt, any claim he might have had to company assets would have expired decades ago. You have no legal standing to demand anything." Tom stepped closer to the truck, his hand moving inside his jacket in a gesture that was probably meant to be intimidating. But Silas had seen real violence in Vietnam, and he recognized the difference between genuine threat and theatrical posturing. Legal standing can be complicated when the original ownership involves criminal activity, Tom said, but physical possession is usually much simpler to establish. "I know you found the cash, McCrae. I know you've been to the cave. And I know that you're going to take me there, either voluntarily or under circumstances that will be much less pleasant for both of us." The pretense of negotiation was finally over. Tom Brewster, Jr. was revealing himself as what Silas had suspected from the beginning, a man who'd inherited his father's willingness to use violence to get what he wanted. The gun Tom produced from his jacket was small but deadly serious, a compact pistol that would be easy to conceal but effective at close range. He held it casually, pointed generally in Silas's direction, but not directly threatening, the gesture of a man who wanted to demonstrate capability without yet committing to violence. "I'd prefer not to use this," Tom said, his voice maintaining its conversational tone despite the weapon in his hand. "But I've invested too much time and money in this project to walk away empty-handed. You're Going to drive north tomorrow morning, and you're going to show me where your parents hid what they stole from my father." Silas felt the familiar calm that had served him well during his military service, the slowing of time and sharpening of focus that came when violence became inevitable. Tom was making the classic mistake of assuming that age and isolation had made his target weak and compliant. He was about to learn otherwise. "Put the gun away, son," Silas said quietly. "You don't want to do this." "Actually, I do want to do this," Tom replied, his mask of civility finally slipping completely. "My father spent 40 years looking for that cash, and he died still obsessing about the fortune that Jacob McCrae and your whore of a mother stole from him. I'm going to finish what he started." The insult to Maria's memory was the final provocation Silas needed. His hand moved to the door handle while his left foot found the clutch pedal, preparing for the explosive action that would either save his life or end it in the next few seconds. "Last chance, old man," Tom said, raising the pistol to aim directly at Silas's chest. "Drive north, or die here in this parking lot." Bristle's attack came without warning, the big dog launching himself through the passenger window like a missile of fur and fangs. Tom had made the fatal error of focusing entirely on Silas while forgetting about the 100-pound predator watching from the truck's cab. The gun went off as Bristle struck Tom's gun arm, the bullet shattering the truck's side mirror instead of finding human target. Silas was moving before Tom hit the ground, rolling out of the driver's side door, while the man struggled with Bristle's weight and the burning pain of teeth crushing the bones in his wrist. The gun had fallen during the impact, skittering across the asphalt and coming to rest near the rear tire of Tom's SUV. "Call him off," Tom screamed, trying to protect his throat from Bristle's snapping jaws, while using his uninjured hand to beat ineffectively at the dog's massive head. "Call him off." "Bristle, enough!" Silas commanded, and the dog immediately released his grip and stepped back, though he remained poised to attack again if Tom made any threatening moves. Tom rolled onto his side, clutching his mangled wrist while blood soaked through his expensive shirt sleeve. His face was pale with shock and pain, but his eyes still burned with the fanatical intensity that had driven him to threaten an old man in a motel parking lot. "This isn't over," he gasped. "You think you've won something, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. My father had partners, people who knew about the cash and what it was worth. They're not going to give up just because you fed me to your damn dog." Silas picked up Tom's pistol and checked the safety before tucking it into his belt. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, despite decades of peaceful mountain living. Some skills never faded. Completely, no matter how long they went unused. "Your father's partners are all dead," Silas said. "They died 70 years ago when their greed and violence finally caught up with them. Just like you're going to die if you keep following in his footsteps." "You're wrong," Tom insisted, struggling to sit up despite his injuries. "Some of them survived, had families, passed down information about the company's operations. I'm not the only one looking for that gold." The claim might have been true or simply the desperate bluff of a man trying to maintain some leverage despite his obvious defeat. Either way, it suggested that Tom's pursuit of the cash was part of a larger pattern, that other descendants of the Granite Creek Company might eventually make their own attempts to claim what they considered stolen property. Silas found Tom's cell phone in the man's jacket pocket and crushed it under his boot heel, then did the same to the SUV's tires, using a knife from his pocket. The actions would buy him time to leave Santos Valley before Tom could summon help or reinforcements, but they wouldn't solve the fundamental problem of other potential claimants. "Elena was right," Silas said, as he prepared to leave Tom bleeding in the motel parking lot. "You're not really interested in family history. You're just another greedy fool who thinks violence can solve problems that require wisdom." He whistled for Bristle, who gave Tom one final threatening stare before following his human back to the truck. As they drove away from the Desert Rose Motel, Silas caught a glimpse of Tom in his rearview mirror, still sitting on the asphalt and shouting curses that couldn't quite mask his pain and humiliation. The confrontation was over, but Silas understood that his problems were just beginning. 6 months later, Silas McCrae stood at the edge of a cliff in the Wind River Range, watching the spring sun paint the valley below in shades of gold and green. The long Wyoming winter had finally broken, filling the air with the sound of melting snow and the promise of new growth. Beside him, Bristle dozed in the warm afternoon light, content in the way that only comes from being exactly where one belongs. The cave behind the waterfall was empty now, its contents distributed according to a plan that had taken months to develop and execute. The gold had gone to establish a scholarship fund for Native American students studying environmental science, administered through Elena Vasquez's Historical Society. The weapons and artifacts had been donated to museums that could preserve them properly, while ensuring their stories would be told accurately rather than romanticized. Most importantly, his mother's journal had been transcribed and published as part of a book about women's roles in the frontier period. Maria Santos McCrae Silas had legally added her name to his own, was no longer a forgotten casualty of outlaw violence, but a documented example of courage under impossible circumstances. Her words would outlive the legends and lies that had obscured her memory for 70 years. Elena had become both friend and ally in the months following Tom Brewster Jr.'s failed extortion attempt. Her research had confirmed what Silas suspected, that Tom's documents were sophisticated forgeries designed to support a false narrative about the Granite Creek Company's dissolution. The real Thomas Brewster Sr. had indeed been the violent psychopath described in Maria's journal, and his son had inherited both his father's obsession and his willingness to use criminal methods to achieve his goals. Tom himself was serving a 5-year sentence in a federal prison, convicted on charges that included assault with a deadly weapon, interstate fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion. His claims about other surviving company descendants had proven false, the desperate fabrication of a man trying to maintain some psychological advantage even as his PTT schemes collapsed around him. The legal proceedings had been complicated, but ultimately satisfying. Silas's military record and Patricia Wells's carefully constructed documentation had established his legitimacy as Jacob McCrae's heir, while Elena's historical research had proven his parents' innocence of Tom's accusations. More importantly, the process had connected him with distant cousins in the Santos family, who welcomed him warmly once they understood who he was and how he'd found them. Carmen Santos's granddaughter had indeed been curious about her lost aunt, and the reunion had provided closure that none of them had expected to find. Maria's nephew, now in his 60s, remembered stories his mother had told about the spirited young woman who'd chosen adventure over security. Her great-nieces and great-nephews embraced Silas as the living link to family history they'd thought was permanently lost. But perhaps the most meaningful discovery had come through Elena's connections with tribal historians in New Mexico. Maria's Apache grandmother had been a repository of traditional knowledge about the land and its secrets, and her influence on Maria had been far greater than anyone realized. The routes the Granite Creek Company had used for their smuggling operations had originally been sacred pathways, traveled by indigenous peoples for centuries before white settlers arrived to exploit and commercialize them. That knowledge explained Bristle's behavior during their journey south and his uncanny ability to locate the hidden cave. His wolf heritage carried genetic memories of those ancient trails, instincts that had guided him to places his human companion needed to find. The connection between past and present ran deeper than simple family history. It touched on relationships between land, memory, and belonging that transcended individual human lives. Silas had returned to his mountain cabin with new understanding of his place in the world. The solitude he'd sought for decades remained precious, but it was no longer the isolation of a man running from painful truths. Instead, it was the chosen retreat of someone who'd faced his history honestly and found peace in accepting both its shadows and its light. His daily routines hadn't changed dramatically. He still rose before dawn, maintained his small garden, and spent long evenings reading by firelight while Bristle dozed at his feet. But now, those quiet moments carried the weight of connection rather than separation. He wasn't alone in the world. He was the inheritor of courage that had been passed down through generations, the keeper of stories that deserved to be preserved and honored. The package Frank Holloway had asked him to deliver in Albuquerque had turned out to be adoption papers for a family trying to reunite with children separated by bureaucratic complications. The favor had connected Silas to a network of people who quietly helped others navigate systems that were often more hindrance than help to those who needed assistance most. He'd found himself becoming part of that network, using his newfound legal identity to occasionally assist others who faced similar challenges. Age and experience had taught him that some forms of isolation were necessary for survival, while others were simply cowardice dressed up as preference. The mountains would always be his home, but they no longer needed to be his entire world. He'd learned the difference between solitude and loneliness, between necessary distance and willful disconnection. As the sun settled toward the western peaks, Silas pulled his mother's wedding ring from his pocket and held it up to catch the fading light. The diamond was small but clear, a symbol of love that had survived violence, betrayal, and 7 decades of silence. Tomorrow he would drive down to Bear Creek and mail the ring to Elena, who would ensure it found its way to Maria's family in Santos Valley. It belonged with people who would understand its significance and treasure its history. The truth had been harder than the silence, but infinitely more valuable. Maria Santos McCrae had been a woman of courage who'd chosen love over safety and died protecting the future she'd helped create. Her son had finally learned to honor that sacrifice by living with the same courage she'd shown in her final moments. Bristle stirred beside him, yellow eyes alert to sounds and scents that marked the transition from day to night. Soon, they would return to the warmth of the cabin, to coffee and firelight, and the peaceful routine of mountain living. But now, they carried stories that connected their quiet existence to the larger human story of love, loss, and the persistent hope that drives people to fight for better futures, even when victory seems impossible. The mountains held their secrets close, but some secrets were meant to be shared.